Well, good evening, everyone, and welcome to our evening distinguished lecture. I see many faces out there to revel in our community, members of the Mi'kmaq Nation, Maliseet, people from Presque Isle, men, and I think particularly women for this particular talk. Our speaker tonight has a lot of experience in this area. And Bunny and her husband Harold, sitting here, came up in 1981, I believe, and slept on floors and in drafty buildings and Holton worked with the Association of Aroostook Indians, and ultimately on up to Presque Isle to work with what is now the Aroostook Band of Micmacs in the quest for federal recognition. So in many ways, this is a homecoming. And we're thrilled to have our friends return home. I know tears and hugs and many reunions have occurred in the last couple of days. I suspect that everyone here has read Bunny's biography, or you probably wouldn't be here. There are many books, and her books, I believe, are on sale at the bookstore. But books about Native Wabanaki women and beyond. What I like about this is Bunny and Harold's work here in Presque Isle launched. They're now in Manhattan, Kansas at Kansas State University. But it launched from Presque Isle to a global endeavor. My anthropology textbook, these are the authors. So my students read the text written by these people and two others. That's exciting. I don't believe my students knew that authors and textbooks were actually people. But they do now. So it's a real privilege, and I'm honored to welcome Bunny McBride home. So please join me in giving Bunny a warm.
Thank you, David. I can't tell you how happy I am to be here and how many times my eyes have welled up with tears just seeing old friends, just seeing progress in the Micmac community, and just seeing the land here, the spaciousness and the big sky, just how beautiful it all is. It's just been a wonderful homecoming. And I want to thank David Putnam for all of his good care, and also Dr. Wong for his, and also Rachel Rice for her good care with the media for tonight. And I want to thank you all for coming. It's wonderful for you to be here, wonderful for me to be here. Let me get my technology going right here. I'll give you a second to read that quote. Are we going to turn down the lights maybe just a little in the back? Or? That's too much for me. I need to see a little something. Okay, that's perfect. Is that good for you guys? Okay. For better or worse, we are all heirs of the past. I think there are very few of us who cannot benefit from a long backward look at what we have attained and some quiet rumination on the tasks we still have to complete. So this is what I was thinking of when I was preparing this talk. And in this collage, you see really a small sampling of women that I've interviewed over the last 35 years or so. And they're women from all corners of the world. Whoops. Is that red dot anywhere? Yeah. Like here, well, there's my grandmother. I have interviewed here. Everybody should interview their grandmother. This is a woman named Berit Siri. She is a Sami woman, a Laplander from the Arctic area of Norway. She's a reindeer herder. Below her this is Binta Kinte. I don't know, how many of you have seen the film series Roots or heard about it? Okay, this is the woman in Gambia in West Africa who Alex Haley, when he was hunting for his roots, she was his connection back to his deep ancestor, Kunta Kinte. So I interviewed her some years ago. Let's see, this woman is Munira, and she is a Bijago woman off the coast of West Africa. And she lives in a matrilineal society. They make beautiful coil pots, which is what she's doing here. This woman here is Fatima and her little daughter, and she's a Tuareg nomad on the edge of the Sahara, as is this woman here. Well, here we have Mary Santapass, who's in the front row tonight. And below we have her daughter, so she's a well-known McBride basket maker, among other things, and her daughter, Roldina, and more of them down here. There's Marlene and Cheryl Lafford, her niece, Mary's niece, and Mary again, and Max, who's all grown up now. And so, and this is, well, I'll tell you a little more about the others later, but when I was thinking about this talk, I put together this collage, and then I just looked at it. And I really thought, what am I going to do? And I looked some more, and one of the women included here, that's Jean Weltfish. And she is by far the most intimidating woman I ever interviewed. She's an anthropologist, and she's no longer living, but she was a student of Franz Boas, who's often referred to as the father of American anthropology. And she's best known for her for an ethnography she wrote about the Pawnee called The Lost Universe, and it's still considered the authoritative work on the Pawnee. It came out back in 1965. And she was a bold social activist, and she really spoke out and openly challenged racism, classism, sexism, and she was ultimately called in for questioning by the U.S. House Committee on Un-American Activities during the Red Scare in the 1950s. And all of the trumped up suspicions about her cost her her professorship at Columbia University. And it was at the height of her career. And it wasn't until 10 years later that she was able to get an academic position back. And without a doubt, she gave me the feistiest interview of my life. It happened in 1980. Did my sound go out?
Yeah, I think they're trying to turn it down and stop the feedback.
Oh, okay. Can you hear me all right? Is there anybody who can't hear me? Okay, I'll just talk up. So in 1980, I interviewed her. She was 78 years old. And the injustices that had been done to her during her lifetime really fueled her anger about the injustices that were done to others. And so she had really very little tolerance for scholarship that wasn't going to help alleviate the injustices. So I come to her as a young graduate anthropology student, and I wanted to interview her for my master's thesis on the topic of subjectivity and objectivity in anthropology. And so I got in touch with her, and she says to me, "This topic bores me." And then she adds, "Actually, there's a lot of fancy business in anthropology, and it all bores me. It's stupid." And then before I could pose a single question to her, she catapulted a question at me, and she said, "My dear, how old are you?" And I said, 29. And she said, "Well then, you could not possibly be capable of having anything like a spectrum." And I was really insulted. I thought, I have a spectrum. I've traveled. I've seen the world a bit. And then I thought, well, okay, it's not as wide as hers. That's absolutely true. But I wanted it to be wider. That was the reason I was there. And so I really persisted. And finally, she came forward and she responded. And she gave she just spewed forth this commentary on the human condition. And it was demanding, it was thought-provoking, it was just a torrent of words. But what really stood out to me in that flow of words was this one statement. She said, "The key problem for anthropologists to address is inequality." I feel like that. Who was that guy who did the Republican response and had a drink? Well, that's me. Anyway, well, as it turned out, that was her last interview of her life. She died 3 months later. But I tell you what she said about the key thing for anthropologists to address is inequality, that really stayed with me. That was really burned in my consciousness. So in the 33 years since that interview with her, my spectrum has widened a bit. And I owe a lot of that widening to the women pictured here in this collage, and to many others who are, held in the photographs in my mind. So initially, when I was invited to give this lecture, David Putnam suggested that I might want to talk about the roles, the economic and leadership roles of Wabanaki women through time. And that has been a thread in my writings about Maine's indigenous peoples, but as I thought about Wabanakis, I found, collectively and individually, I found myself also thinking about other women from other corners of the world whose lives I had come to know through my writing. And what they all have in common is amazing perseverance and resilience in the face of hardship, qualities that have inspired me time and time again. So, sorry, David, I decided that what I would do for this talk is that I would base it on this collectivity of women, and that I would reflect on how the lives of these women have helped shape my approach to anthropology and writing, and also how they've impacted my priorities and my sense of purpose. We have less than an hour, so obviously I can't talk about everybody here, but I thought what I would do is focus on 4 women who are representative of this collectivity of women. And so it will include a Mi'kmaq basket maker, a Penobscot dancer, a prolific Euro-American author, and a Chinese human rights activist. First, I should give you a little background about how I came into anthropology. And I came by way of journalism, and that shift happened in 1978 when I traveled with 8 other journalists to the People's Republic of China. We were the first, among the very first American journalists to go into China after Nixon's 1972 visit set the stage for normalization of U.S. and Chinese relations after 25 years of adversarial separation. We were there an entire month, and after returning to our homes, we all shared our pieces with one another. And as I looked through the written and broadcast pieces by my colleagues, I was amazed to see 9 different Chinas. I thought, how can this be? We all did practically the same thing every day. And of course, to some extent, every journalist asks questions and interprets events from a particular vantage point. And that plays a role in shaping their story. But since we did nearly the same thing every day, I found that those contrasts kind of baffling and troubling even. And I began to wonder how much of my own view was shaping. How much was shaping what I saw? How much was what was behind my head shaped what I saw? What was in my head shaped what I saw in front of me? And how much I was the prisoner, really, of my own vantage point. And at that point, I felt the need for some guidelines beyond basic journalism objectivity. And I decided at that point to go to graduate school in anthropology. And what I was hoping for was to widen my cross-cultural perspective and to gain some new research methodologies. So I did that. And when I finished my MA at Columbia, I moved to Hallowell, Maine, 5 hours south of here. And I thought I would use that old riverside town as my home base for the writing that I wanted to do, focusing on indigenous peoples, especially on peoples in Africa, which is where I'd already done a fair amount of writing. And then one of those life surprises happened. And I got sidetracked. And I got sidetracked by a friend who was working with the Association of Aroostook Indians. And she said to me, "Oh, it's so great you've done a degree in anthropology." She said the Association of Aroostook Indians is looking for an anthropologist. They need an anthropologist to undo a problem. I said, what was the problem? And she said, well, it was the exclusion of Mi'kmaq and Aroostook from the Maine Indian Settlement Act last year. And I looked at her and I said, well, I'm not a real anthropologist. I said, I just got my MA in anthropology really as background for what I wanted to write about. And I said, but there's a real anthropologist coming to Maine. He's a Dutchman. And I was speaking of this guy here. And it was who had become my friend during graduate school and later became my husband. So when I told Harold about what was happening up here in Aroostook County and about this job as the Director of Research and Development for the Association of Aroostook Indians. He was interested. So we drove up together and we met at the old Holton schoolhouse that's not there anymore, this 3-story brick building that was haunted. You know that, I think. The night guard left every night at 10 because he was afraid that he wouldn't survive the night. Anyway, so we went up to meet the board of the Association of Aroostook Indians, the board, the staff, and some elders who were there. And I sat in on the meeting, and you know, the situation for the Micmacs did not seem very hopeful at all, because the Settlement Act had signed away any future claims by Wabanakis within the state of Maine. But then, when the official part of the meeting ended, this is where I need you, Marlene. To come here. She's going to play act this with me. We haven't rehearsed this at all. But when the official part of the meeting ended, one of the elders came up to me. You remember Tilly West? McMac's in the room, Maliseed's in the room. So Tilly West came up to me, and I'll be Tilly, you be me. And Tilly said, you know what happened to me this week?
What happened?
I got a brand new baby daughter.
And what's her name?
Well, I didn't ask her that. I should have, I realized it. I said congratulations. I said, congratulations.
Thank you.
And she said, you know what the first thing I did with my brand new baby granddaughter?
What did you do?
I took her tiny little hand in mine, and I rolled it into a fist. And I said to her, you have to fight for your rights in life. And then Tilly looked me square in the eye, and she said, we may look defeated, but we're not. We just need some help. So it was a poignant moment for me. I was just a bystander. I was watching this interview and hearing what was going on. Well then, with that in mind, I got in the car with Harold and we started driving south to Hollowell, 4 hours from Holton. And while we were making the road, Harold said to me, what would you think if they offer me the job if I proposed that we split it? And he said, then we could spend 3 days a week up north, working, you know, on the Micmac case, and we could spend the rest of the week down here in Hollowell, focusing on our other research and writing. And so I was open to that. And basically what happened is they offered, he proposed the job split, they said yes, and we began. And we launched into this rhythm where early Monday morning, we'd unplug the car from, you know, we had to keep it from freezing because we were getting up at 4 o'clock. We would drive 4 hours from Hollowell, Maine, up to Holton, and we would land at the office at the old schoolhouse, and we would begin our work. And we'd work deep into the night, and we slept at the old schoolhouse without the night guard because he was afraid. And we slept on a foam mattress this wide. And you might think, wow, that looks like a really small foam mattress for Harold. But it wasn't just for Harold, it was also for me. So we slept like this. We spooned our whole first year working with Micmacs. And it was kind of comforting every night after a long, hard day of work. And Harold and I had made an agreement that he would teach me everything he knew about anthropological fieldwork and analysis, and I would teach him everything I knew about writing and publishing. He took the lead in political strategizing with legal services, who were helping us, and working out a theoretical basis for the Micmac federal recognition effort and doing deep historical research. And then I took the lead in writing grant proposals and writing articles about Micmacs to bring them to public attention, gathering oral histories and genealogies from the elders, and also helping to establish the Micmac Basket Bank with Marlene Sanapass, who was the lead person in that endeavor. Most of the Micmacs who I interviewed were elders. They all were elders, but most of them were women. And the only one still living is Mary Santapass. All the others who I interviewed are no longer with us here. And because Mary can still tell her own story, plus she has a bevy of children and grandchildren who can tell her story, I thought I would tell you about another Micmac basket maker, Sarah Jacobs Hartwell Lund. And Sarah, like Mary, picked potatoes, picked blueberries, and made baskets. But they had very different family lives, as you'll hear. So I'm going to tell you a little bit about Sarah. Here she is. And usually I talk with Sarah in her kitchen, her garden, or in her living room, where she wove her baskets. And her house always smelled delicious. Smelled of something savory along with the smell of freshly scraped ash splints. And no matter how busy she was, she always made time to talk, and she always made food. You couldn't get out of there without being incredibly filled up. Her life story was a really rough one. It had more twists and turns than a porcupine quill basket weave. And I was coming out of a really particularly difficult time in my own life when I was interviewing her. And because of my own struggles, I found myself listening to her not only with anthropological ears, listening for cultural patterns, but I also was somebody there just with a human heart, looking for perspective. Her life began in 1927, and it was on Eel River Bar Micmac Reserve in New Brunswick, Canada. Her parents were actually from Cambridge Reserve down in Nova Scotia, but they were staying with relatives up at Eel River because it was a good place to make and sell baskets, and also because her dad could trap nearby. So soon after Sarah came along, her dad built a log camp across the bay on Gaspé Peninsula, and he took the family there. When I asked Sarah what her earliest memory was, well, it really got to me. This is what she said. It was of her mother calling for help. When I was a tiny girl, she told me, Mama was sick. She used to holler, "Sarah, go get my pail," and she would vomit blood into it. When I was just 4 and a half, she died. At her funeral, I crawled into her casket. I'd always slept with her, and I thought it was a fancy bed. My father gave me the worst spanking of my life at that funeral. More loss came for Sarah when she was 7, and that was when her father took her to the Indian residential school at Shubenacadie in Nova Scotia, and then went on to make his living as a seasonal worker and a trapper. Like the other children at the mission school, Sarah was punished for speaking her language, straps on the hand, into bed without supper. Just as an aside, when she told me this, I don't think I really realized what it meant to lose your language. It wasn't until some years later when I was interviewing an old Ojibwa woman, and she was born in the year 1900, and she was in a nursing home, and she told me, she said, I miss my language so much. She said that I had my grandson bring me a little tape recorder, and I recorded myself speaking my language. And when I feel lonely and out of place, I listen to it. As for Sarah, within 1 year at the residential school, she lost her language. She lost her native tongue. Then in 1941, when Sarah was 14, her dad became ill, and she left school to take care of him. Once she nursed him back to health, he set out again for his life of trapping and seasonal labor. And Sarah went to live with an army wife, an army widow who had 7 children. And it was one of many caretaking and housekeeping jobs that she would have in her lifetime. The next year, she worked for a wealthy couple who lived just 3 miles from Eel River Reserve. And so yearning to see and be with her own people, she would often walk the 3 miles and spend time at the reserve whenever she could get away. And during one visit, she met Abe Hartwell, He was a Micmac trapper who stayed there with his sister whenever he came home from an expedition. Abe reminded Sarah of her dad, and drawn to the familiar, she married him a year later. She was 15, he was 33. Then the day after her 16th birthday, Sarah gave birth to her son, and then 2 other children came in quick succession. Abe quit his solo trapping life, and like many Micmacs of that era, he and Sarah took up a migratory life together with their kids in tow. And Sarah described it like this. Abe and I always moved around. From April to June, we'd be living on the reserve, digging clams in Dalhousie. June, July, we'd make potato baskets, usually in Maine. In August, we raked berries in Maine, and during September and October, we worked the potato harvest there. If we found a good rent, we'd stay after the harvest. We'd stay until March. As migrant laborers during that particular time, they really knew about lousy housing. Leaky barns, granaries with rats, really run-down shacks. But Sarah loved to say, I could turn any place into a home. She was a real adventurer, and she liked moving around with Abe. He was really the one love of her life. But there was a fatal flaw in their relationship, and well, Sarah described it like this. Abe's alcoholism was something awful. He used to beat me so bad and leave me for months at a time. I tried to work when he was gone, but I had 3 kids, and it was really hard. In 1949, Sarah did something she swore she would never do. Sorry. She put her 2 boys in the Shubenacadie school, and her youngest child married Alexina with a friend, and then she left Abe. In the years that followed, Sarah married 3 more times. In 1952, she wed a Norwegian sea captain who she met when his ship was in port in Dalhousie. And they honeymooned in Tokyo. I mean, people who would come up and interview Sarah later in life when she was a little basket maker working up in Fort Kent, I mean, nobody thought to ask her, have you seen the world? But she really had seen the world. That husband, he bought a home for them in Limestone, Maine, and she worked at the local taxi stand there. And then whenever she could, she would meet him at the various ports where his ship came in. And in 1955, she met him in San Francisco with the happy news that she was carrying her child. And then she came back to Limestone, and then she miscarried. And then on the heels of that sorrow, she received horrible news that her husband's ship, there'd been an explosion, and he died. So she had a year on her own, and then she married a local fellow in Limestone, and he got her to sell her house and buy a cheap trailer, and then he spent all her money, and then he abused her, and then after less than a year, she left him. In 1957, she hired on as a housekeeper for a divorced farmer who had 3 children, and he said, you can bring your kids. So she moved in with him. She got her 2 boys out of Shubenacadie, and when neighbors began to talk about the arrangement, the guys suggested that perhaps they should marry. So they did, and Sarah said, that was a marriage of convenience for both of us. We never even shared a bed. But then, within months of their wedding, he began drinking. She stayed with him nonetheless for 4 years, until 1961, when her oldest boy went into a detention center, and that just made her get out. She then found shelter with an elderly couple, and she took care of each one of them. First, the woman died, and then the man died, and then Sarah was alone again. By 1963, at age 36, Sarah was at the end of her rope, and she really hung there for some time. For nearly 6 years, she told me, I lived with Micmac friends, and I did nothing but drink and helped them make baskets. Nearly 6 years. Then she says, I got fed up with myself. I can still hear her saying that. I got fed up with myself. She took a job with a Maliseet fellow named Pearlie, who hired her to come and live with him and his parents in Caribou. He lived with his parents, and helped to take care of them. And so she took care of them until they died in 1970. And then Pearlie, who was in his 60s, he said, well, why don't you stay on and take care of me? And so she agreed to do that. But she'd really reached a crossroads at that point. And she said, this is what she said, I was thinking, why, the old gibbers? I have to turn my life around. So she decided to get serious about basketry. And she said, I figured I could make a living weaving baskets. All I needed was someone to help. And all of a sudden, out of nowhere, shows up Abe. She had never stopped loving the man behind the alcohol. So they started over. They moved in together. They made beautiful baskets together. And both of them loved the work. And I loved watching Sarah make a basket, because whenever she finished making a basket, she would throw it hard onto the ground, onto the floor. And it wasn't to test its strength. It was really to prove its strength. And it was really to prove that she could make something that wouldn't break. After a while, she told me, Pearlie missed company, and he really missed her. He said he missed my company and he missed my good cooking. So he moved in with us, and we taught him a thing or two about making baskets so he could help. Sometimes, said Sarah, but far less in the past, Abe would go on a drunk. But he did not abuse her. He always came back, and Pearlie was there as a balancer for both of them. To me, the only thing more stunning than the hardships that Sarah described were her resilience and the amazing gratitude she expressed that the end of her life was better than the beginning and the middle. In the 1980s, her daughter, Mary Alexina, came looking for Abe and Sarah, not expecting much from the parents who had abandoned her. A dozen years later, after Sarah's death, Mary wrote to Harold and me about that visit. This is what she said in part. My mother had changed. She was so warm-hearted, and being with her made me feel so good inside that I cried. She put her arms around me and she said, I love you, girl. I am so sorry. Each morning I watched birds flock to her for feeding, and at night we had long talks in her bedroom. Listening to her, I started to believe in angels. Saying goodnight, I would hug and kiss her on the cheek. Before I left, she made me a basket. Sorry, I didn't show you that picture of David and Sarah. That's their kid. That's Pearlie in the middle. Before I left, she made me a basket, and she gave me a blanket that she made. I still have both, and sometimes I bring the blanket out to hug. To me, my mother had become a grand lady. So, what is the measure of a life? The length of our troubles, or the moments we transcend them with love? Our failings, or our contributions? Looking at Sarah's life through a broad scope, distinct contributions come within view. For example, beyond all the people she took care of in her lifetime, she helped keep the threatened art of Wabanaki basketry alive, selling her wares through the Heuristic Micmac Basket Bank, participating in the film, the book, and the exhibit, Our Lives in Our Hands, and making a basket for the band's permanent collection. Moreover, Sarah gave her oral history. Her descriptions on how she and Abe, as well as her parents and grandparents, followed seasonal work opportunities back and forth against the Canada-U.S. border, that provided evidence of Micmac presence in Maine through time. This was vital for the Aroostook Band's land claim and federal recognition case. And for me personally, Sarah's story put my own troubles in perspective. It wasn't just that my challenges in life paled compared to hers. For me, it was really a challenge, a call to buck up no matter what life throws at you, and to be sure that the end is better than the beginning. When I feel off-center or unproductive, I hear Sarah saying, "By the old jibbers, I have to turn my life around." And for me professionally, and this was really significant, piecing together the Micmac oral histories, not just Sarah's, but also Mary Sanapas's, Carolyn Copage's, Lizzie Phillips, a whole collection of them. Putting those together had a really significant impact on my writing. Working on them drove home the importance of aiming to write in a way that not only furthers scholarship, but also is meaningful to the people about whom you're writing. They set me on a course of working collaboratively, and they shed light on the power of biography to reveal cultural patterns and convey history in a compelling and widely accessible way. Because the oral histories were gathered on behalf of the Aroostook Band, I never published them, but Sarah and the others gave me permission to use them when I taught, and in particular when I taught a course on indigenous peoples. And I would start that class with these oral histories, and it blew me away what happened. What I saw was how these stories grabbed the attention of students. I mean, hearing directly a life story, it alerted them to structural violence. It shattered stereotypes. It fueled their empathy. It made them interested in colonial history and its ramifications. So really, I came to see biography as a way to make history real to people. So I worked with the Aroostook Band throughout the 1980s, but I didn't do that full time. I was also teaching sometimes and also taking journalism assignments in various parts of the world. So one day in 1988, this guy had taken me to the airport, and we were saying goodbye again, and I was about to go to Africa. And he looked at me and gave me a big hug, and then he said, "Why are you always going so far away when there's so much to write about right here?" And then he handed me this newspaper clipping of Molly Spotted Elk, a famous Penobscot Indian dancer who lived from 1903 to 1977. And it was really a haunting picture. I could not get her out of my mind. And since Molly was no longer alive, I couldn't contact her. But when I came back, I called her youngest sister, Eunice Nelson Bauman, who was also an anthropologist who we had come to know through our work with the Micmacs. And after a long talk with Eunice about Molly, Eunice suggested that I get in touch with Molly's daughter, Jean Moore, who had been looking for somebody to write her mom's biography. And several people had approached her for the job to see if she would let them do it, and she had turned them all down. And then for reasons, well, surprising reasons I won't go into here for sake of time, but she decided that I was the one to do her mom's story. And after we spent a week together at her home, she turned over to me all of her boxes of Molly's memorabilia. Photographs, diaries, correspondence, all these things. And I opened those boxes, and they just opened a world to me. Molly's life began and ended on Indian Island, the Penobscot Reservation in Old Town, Maine. And her mother was a Maliseet, and her father was a Penobscot. And Molly was the eldest of 8 children, and because of that, she was expected to help support all of her younger siblings. So she was sent out by her mom on the performance road from the time she was a teenager. And in the years that followed, her talent, her beauty, her determination, they afforded a really wide range of stage experience for her, from vaudeville to Wild West shows to chic New York nightclubs. to starring in the film The Silent Enemy, which was a groundbreaking 1930 film about Ojibwa Indians surviving a hunger winter. In 1931, Molly danced before royalty and heads of state for the Colonial Exposition in Paris. And she also performed at various clubs in the city. She really found European audiences far more sophisticated than Americans and much more appreciative of the authentic native dances that she wanted to do. And so she decided to stay in France. And then she fell into this passionate love affair with a journalist from Paris Soir. One of the things in her papers were his love letters. I would like every man in the room to have a copy of them, because this woman, this man, oh my goodness, he could write the most remarkable letters. They were beautiful. They had me sweating. Anyway, they often wrote articles together, Molly and her husband Jean, and sometimes he appeared on stage with her drumming while she danced. He also encouraged her to complete a book of Penobscot legends that she had collected when she was a child. In 1934, Jean and Molly had a daughter together, and 4 years later, they married. But then, they were torn apart by World War II. When Germans came in and occupied France, her husband Jean went into hiding, and Molly and her daughter escaped on foot over the Pyrenees Mountains into Spain, and ultimately made it safely back to the Penobscot Reservation in Maine. But Jean, tragically, he died in a refugee camp before he could join them. The death of Molly's husband threw her into the depths of depression, and eventually into a mental institution. There, she turned to her diary, as she always did, and she really strove to sort out her life through writing. And she reflected on her life with an astuteness that really would have surprised her doctors. It was amazing to me as I was reading those diaries. And after a year, she was allowed to go home to Indian Island. And she spent the latter part of her life very quietly on the reservation, tending the garden, making baskets, making Indian dolls, walking in the woods. In her diaries, among the things Molly talked about, she described her efforts to preserve and foster respect for Native traditions by revealing them to the public through dance, and also through writing. She had performed mostly Indian dances for mostly white audiences, and unlike those French audiences, the Americans usually applauded war whoops, and cliche savage gestures and sexy Indian things. These are the ways she described it in her diary. And sometimes they taunted her, and other times they swung to the other side of the spectrum, and they would impose these idealistic, romanticized notions of who she was. These reactions really caused her to wrestle with a discrepancy between her internal definition of who she was and the external ones that were pressed in on her. And really, the knotted thread that ran through her life was an identity quest. It was really a search to figure out what of her past she wished to carry into her future, and this relentless effort to fit together the two worlds that tugged at her. After I read and transcribed most of her diaries, I came to understand that the aim of the journals, at least in part, was to affirm her native self in the coercive arena of acculturation, something that all Native people continue to face today. Initially as a non-Native person, I wrestled with my role as Molly's biographer, and I'll never forget the first time I saw a pair of her size 5 dance moccasins. And I looked from those to my size 9 foot, and I thought, I am never going to be able to step into those shoes and tell her story. But really the coming together of distinct cultures was both the process and the purpose of Molly's biography. And as I discovered while I was writing, Molly held this purpose central in her own life. She challenged the notion of separateness even as she suffered from it. And she was always endeavoring to build the bridge between Penobscot culture and the larger world in which she moved. The very first stage name she chose for herself was Nieberban. It's the Penobscot word for northern lights. And when I read that, I thought in many ways that name symbolizes the light or the insight that Molly sought for herself and tried to share with others through her art. I found this statement in her diary: "With hard work, I will achieve my goal, not fame, but realization." Reading this, I really felt that her goal matched my own. I too wanted to understand the inner and outer forces that shape a life. And I wanted to write a book that pressed me and readers to reach across the cultural divide as Molly did. And it seemed to me that if I could write the book in a way that made people feel like they were taking Molly's arm and entering her life with open minds, that they might be witnesses to unfamiliar adversities and strengths that would help to shatter well-harbored stereotypes, maybe stir a little empathy, and help pry open channels of communication. At its best, I think a retrospective on a life does much more than fill in various cultural gaps and round out the historical picture. It can help us gain a vision for the future, not only for the society in which we wish to live, but also for the methods and the missions that we bring to our disciplines. Building on the collaborative effort that I'd had, the endeavors with the Aroostook Micmac community, I turned to Molly's daughter and to Molly's sister, Eunice. And beyond interviewing both women extensively on numerous occasions, I asked them to read each chapter when I finished it. And both of them shared my commitment to telling Molly's story fully and honestly. And they gave me feedback, but they didn't censor anything. And far from limiting my work or compromising my work or imposing something on my work, our collaboration, our co-laboring to bring a story to full fruition, that's what made the work meaningful to me. And it also made it more accurate, not only in terms of facts, but in terms of feeling. Passing away in 1977, Molly lived long enough to see the dawn of Wabanaki cultural renewal in the modern era. And with each passing year, recognition of her contributions to that grows. Beyond her life story, which shows the possibility of being rooted in tradition while embracing a wider world, the film that Molly started, Silent Enemy, was reissued as a classic. 2 of the Indian dolls that she made are in the Smithsonian Museum. And the other memorabilia of her life, her diaries and so forth, those are in safekeeping in the Maine Folk Archives at the University of Maine, Orono, very near her home reservation. And in addition, the publishing of her book of Penobscot Legends, which was interrupted during World War II, finally 25 years after her passing, that book was published. All of these are cultural anchors for new generations of Wabanakis. As Molly wrote in her diary, the beautiful things live on to heal the wounds of sorrow. Excuse me. This is the dedication page to Molly's biography. I know. Can you read it? The dedication while I catch my breath. You can all see it. Here. It's right here.
This is the dedication page in Molly's biography. It reads, "This book is dedicated to my mentor friend Henrietta Buckmaster, whose bold and emphatic pen imparted both inspiration and aspiration. I interviewed Henrietta back in 1977.
That's my
Always."
talk. Now that's my talk. Okay, so now thank you, Harold. That was perfect. It's nice to hear another voice. Can I have my glasses back in case I need them? This is Henrietta late in life. I interviewed this woman to whom I dedicated Molly's book. I interviewed her back in 1977, and I always intended to write about her, and it wasn't until this book, this is my first opportunity to do so. And, well, it's been a wonderful experience. Thank you again for inviting me. So, Henrietta was born in 1909. She grew up in New York City. Her father was a newspaper editor. Her mother was a housewife. She was surrounded by books as a child. She learned to read before she went to school. And her parents were just exceedingly proud of their beautiful and extremely bright child. She turned out to be a child prodigy. And her life looked absolutely nothing but promising. But then, just after her 7th birthday, Henrietta contracted polio. And thereafter, she depended on a wheelchair or on leg braces, which made it possible for her to walk very slowly, very short distances. Her parents did everything they could to shelter her from this loss. They minimized activities that focused on her physical limitations, and they encouraged her keen intellectual capacities by sending her to a private all-girls school. At 12 years old, she authored her first publication. By age 18, she had written numerous book reviews for the New York Times Book Review. At 19, she met a kindred spirit, this young man, a poetic fellow named Peter. He asked her on a date, and her parents drove them to the local movie theater. When they came out of the theater, it was an incredibly beautiful night. And Peter says to her, "It's so lovely. Let's walk home." Well, the idea that she would walk home was not anything that had ever occurred to her. She had never walked home. She had never walked that far. It was a half a mile. But she was exhilarated by his innocent sense of her capabilities. And so they walked home, and she made it the entire distance. And she said, by the time we got home, I was in love. They married. And while Peter always encouraged her to walk, sometimes he carried her, as you see here. But in other ways, she carried him. He was also a writer of poems and plays, but Henrietta banked success with writing much more quickly than he did. So it was her work that paid the bills. She wrote stories and feature articles for newspapers and magazines. And in 1955, when she was 25, she published her first book came out, followed by another the next year. She had an incredible ambition, and her ambition to do something meaningful with her life, it was enormous. And it perhaps was to counter what she referred to as the world's appraisal of me as a cripple. Asked if she would have been the same person without polio, this is what she said: "How do I know? What I do know is that when life has tossed you up, you are not complacent. You are impelled to find meaning and purpose and to develop character." Henrietta's landmark historical novel, Let My People Go, which came out in 1941, really bolstered her character and her sense of purpose. She spent 3 years writing and researching this poignant portrayal. Thank you. I need a big one. This poignant portrayal of the anti-slavery movement. And she became deeply committed to what she learned through the endeavor. During that time, this is what she wrote in her diary: "I take on myself like stigmata all the cruelties of persecution and hatred. To me, the only real beauty is in the fostering of each person's dignity, and everything else must be subservient to that." Just a quick comment. There were many glowing reviews of Henrietta's book in all the major publications, and this particular one came from Richard Wright, the famous African-American author, and his searing novel, Native Son, came out just the year before Henrietta's book came out. During her lifetime, Henrietta authored more than 24 books, and they were mostly historical novels. She became known for her widespread humanitarian interests, which included vigorous participation in civil rights as well as movements for the rights of labor, women, prisoners, and Native Americans, not to mention animals. She felt a kinship with all life, and she shaped her personal and professional priorities accordingly. She said, "I spoke for anyone who asked me within the field of minority rights. My question was always, 'You're for minorities? Okay, what time do you want me?' I spoke for groups left, right, and center." She also wrote for minority publications such as the Negro Quarterly, and she joined numerous organizations committed to the disenfranchised. These included groups like the Artists Front for the End to End the War, the National Council of Arts and Sciences and Professions, plus various groups pressing for decolonization. When World War II ended, Henrietta joined the Congress of American Women. She served as one of the group's 13 delegates in the 1945 Women's Peace Conference in France, and that was sponsored by the Women's International Democratic Federation. 800 women from 32 countries attended the conference to consider post-war problems, everything from food and housing shortages to orphan children to rehabilitation of the wounded, restoration of democracy, as well as very specific legal, economic, and social situations of women. Actually, Henrietta traveled there with Jean Wellfish, the woman who told me I didn't have a spectrum, who was also a delegate. And she wrote about it for Women's Day magazine. This came out the following year in 1946. When I met Henrietta in 1974, she was 65 and I was 24. She was very different from Jean Wellfish in terms of how she treated me. At that point in her life, her husband had left her for a walking woman. She had just become editor of the literary and arts pages of an international newspaper, the Christian Science Monitor. She was rebuilding her life and rebuilding that page. She was seeking out writers of conscience, and doing so, she transformed that page into an intercultural, inter-ethnic, interclass dialogue. It became one of the most respected pages in the paper. And it was a place where artists and poets and prisoners and a wide range of movers and shakers had a voice. Some of the best known thinkers in the world wrote for that page. But at the same time, Henrietta nurtured young, unknown writers who yearned to make a difference. And that included me. I have to tell you what brought us together, because it's an unlikely thing. It was her hair. And it happened like this. I was directing a community center in Boston. She made a donation. I wrote her a thank you card. She called me to thank you for my thank you card. Then she said to me, "Is there anybody there who could come and color and cut and style my hair?" She really hated the hassle of salons. It was hard for her to get there. And I said, "I could do that." And so, I mean, I had no idea that opening a bottle of hair dye was going to change my life, but it did. And so I went to her place, and she had, it was a tiny apartment filled with really big thoughts. There were floor-to-ceiling bookshelves and a wide array of visitors who were all drawn to the deep and life-changing conversations that you had when you knew Henrietta. She really knew about listening. The sine qua non of empathy. She got that. And she always wanted to hear the long version of every story that had meaning, any story that had meaning, including things I had to tell her about the kids I was working with at the community center, who at that time were dealing with the violence and the opportunities of desegregation busing, being shipped to white neighborhoods for school. At the time, I was taking a writing workshop with an old Australian essayist who wrote often for Henrietta's pages, and he began to encourage me to send my essays to her. And to my amazement, she accepted them. We became really close friends, and in 1978, I spent a year as her assistant editor. And she talked me into the job, telling me that it would really be doing her a favor. And later, I realized it wasn't that at all. She had done it to mentor me. She really helped me hone my editing skills, and she encouraged a light but effective touch that stayed true to the voice of every author, every writer, while bringing into sharper focus examples of or insights on human dignity. After a decade of friendship with Henrietta, I knew her well. But after she died in 1984, I discovered how much I did not know. When I was researching Molly Spotted Duck's biography in the late 1980s, after Henrietta had died, I read widely about other famous dancers of Molly's era, including this woman, Ruth St. Denis. She was known as the mother of modern dance. To my utter astonishment, when I was reading the acknowledgments in Ruth St. Denis's autobiography, I found that Henrietta had been her ghostwriter. That discovery brought tears to my eyes. I mean, first of all, because I realized that this woman who was unable to walk had managed to be a conduit for a woman who moved with remarkable grace across stages all around the world. And second reason I had tears was because I realized I had never asked Henrietta the question that would have prompted her to tell me about this. For me, this was an unforgettable lesson, that the business of coming to know and understand one another is never finished. We must make a point of asking, even when we think we know. There were many more discoveries for me about Henrietta, because she left all her papers to me. Her personal correspondence, her diaries, her photographs. I kept finding new words from her. I keep finding new words from her that speak to me. When I realized that she had written Ruth St. Denis's biography, 1938 biography, I went to her diary to see what she was writing during that time. And I found this entry, and perhaps I should refer to it as a warning. And it was, "The only sincere biography provides a credo and a direction for others. A mere rehearsal of a glamorous personality is meretricious and contemptible." I also found, a real surprise to me, a 30-page transcript of her statement to the U.S. House Committee on Un-American Activities. Like Gene Weltfish, she had been accused of affiliating with groups that the government labeled as Communist Front organizations. The Congress of American Women, the Artist Front, the Negro Quarterly. Like Gene Weltfish, Henrietta's personal and professional life had suffered as a result. In the statement that Henrietta prepared, this is just the first page, for the committee, she explained her involvement in dozens of organizations like this. "The basis for my activities has always been humane, never political." And then she offered a writer's perspective. "I think a writer stands very close to life, and that her identification with men and women of all races, classes, and creeds is indissoluble. The world is hers to see as clearly as possible. She cuts off her own hand if she separates herself from any other human being, in joy or in sorrow, in conflict or in success." I have this quote on my desk now. And now moving to the fourth woman, the last woman in this quartet. During that earlier mentioned trip I told you about, going to China in 1978 with those other journalists, for several days we were in Beijing, and one afternoon I noticed that almost the entire staff of the hotel was jammed into this one room. And I thought, what are they all doing in there? So out of curiosity, I peeked in, and they were all standing and watching a very small television screen, and you're nodding because you know this, and on that screen, there was a woman. And the one guy near the door said to me, "English lessons." Well, I was really drawn by this woman I saw on the screen, and she was a petite woman, and like everybody else at that time in 1978, she was dressed in a blue Mao jacket and blue Mao trousers. And she taught with incredible gusto and joy, enunciating words with demanding precision, and then putting forth a great encouraging smile. Well, 25 years later, 25 years later, I traveled to Geneva, Switzerland, and I was going to be interviewed as a possible board member for the Women's World Summit Foundation there, which is based there. And the 5 existing board members were from India, Sierra Leone, Kenya, China, and Switzerland. And honestly, I mean, they were the kind of notable woman. I walked into the room and I thought, what the hell am I doing here? I mean, really, it was humbling is too small a word. And anyway, after the interview, they asked me to step out into the hall, and I kind of thought I would just keep right on walking out the door. But I waited in the hall, and in 5 minutes, they came out and they all embraced me and they said, welcome to the board. I now realize, I think a big piece of it, every organization needs a writer. So those of you who want to be able to do things in life, it's really important you learn to write. At dinner that night, I sat next to the board member from China. Wu Qing is her name. And knowing that she'd been an English professor at the Beijing Foreign Studies University, I asked really just on a whim, are you the person I saw teaching Chinese on television in 1978 when I was in China? And she sat up tall and she said, yes, I taught the country English. Well, I soon learned that teaching English was just the tip of Wu Qing's life.
She was the first professor teaching English on TV in China. She's so popular, so well known.
Did you see her?
That time we didn't have TV in my hometown. It's like a city with 100,000 people. We had only one small TV. That's in the government office of my father worked there, so we could watch the TV. There was only one.
Well, and that's how it was in this hotel. I mean, everybody gathered there. So Wu Qing's life began in 1932 in the arms of really remarkable parents. Parents who, Qing likes to say, met on a slow boat to America. That happened in 1923. Her mom was 23 years old at the time, and she was en route, that's her mom on the left, she was en route to Wellesley College, where she would earn a master's degree in American literature. Her father, age 22, was going to Dartmouth for his bachelor's degree, and then would go on to Columbia, where he would earn his PhD. He, like Gene Wellfish, studied with the famous anthropologist Franz Boas, and no doubt Gene Wellfish met Wu Qing's father, Wu Wenzhou. Returning to China after their studies, Wu Qing's father established the sociology and anthropology programs at Nanjing University in Beijing, and her mother, who was already established, a well-known writer, known by the pen name Bing Sin. Am I saying that at all close?
Yes.
Bing Sin, which means I see heart. She also taught there, and she had published her first essay in 1919 as a 19-year-old when she was an undergraduate student, inspired by her involvement in the May 4th student uprising. It was an event that really ignited a widespread political and intellectual protest against imperial rule. In the years that followed, Bing Sin emerged as one of China's most esteemed and prolific 20th century writers. She wrote in the vernacular, which was really unusual, and she broke new literary ground that actually became known as the Bing Sin style. And she became known for her philosophy of love, perseverance, integrity, and boundless optimism. Her life motto was simply, love makes everything possible. Well, her motto was really put to the test in their family, very personally and very often. The family survived decades of China's political vicissitudes. They lived through the brutal Japanese occupation during the Sino-Japanese War from 1937 to 40. After the war, the family moved to Japan, and where Wu Qing's father had a diplomatic post. Wu Qing was 12 at the time, and she protested vehemently going to live among the enemy as she saw it. And she decided to form a gang. It was herself and 5 boys. And she was the leader. And every afternoon after they finished their homework, They would all get up, meet on their bicycles, and they would go and they would try to scare Japanese children. Well, her mom found out about this. And this is Wu Qing said, this is what her mother said. Her mother said, "How could you do that? You are spreading seeds of hatred. What have those children done to you? What if their parents were killed because they protested the war?" So Qing said this was a turning point for her as a 12-year-old. It was the moment when she learned to distinguish between people and government powers. And during their years in Japan, she watched her mother cultivate friendship with many Japanese women. Her mother was then invited to teach Chinese literature in Tokyo, at Tokyo University. And her mother during that time penned many essays encouraging mothers all around the world to befriend one another and to band together to keep their sons from going to war. Her mom participated in the 1945 International Women's Conference that Henrietta Buckmaster and Jean Welkfish went to. I had no idea about that until I worked on this paper. It was just a remarkable, I mean, I didn't pick these women because they went to that, but as I worked on this, I discovered they were all there together. Reflecting on the example, on the lesson and life example she learned from her mom during their years in Japan, Qing said, "My mother taught me what it means to be human." And she said this to me when we were sitting in Geneva at a cafe, and I was actually interviewing her about her family life. And to illustrate her mother's lesson, Qing took my notebook and she drew this Chinese character. And she said, "This is the Chinese character for human being." And she said, "Ren? Ren? Is that how you say it? Ren." And then she stood up and she assumed the pose. We're in the middle of the cafe, and she stands up and she goes like this, and she goes like this. She says, "It means you stand on your 2 feet with your head leaning, tilting to the left slightly toward your heart, because you have to listen to your heart."
Oh, wow.
And I thought that was powerful. And then she added, she said, "And I think one leg stands for one leg stands for integrity and honesty, and the other leg stands for learning and growing. And all of that is what it is to be human." A year after the 1949 Communist Revolution, the Wus came home from Japan. Qing was 18 and she focused on her studies. Her father took a university position, and her mom devoted herself to writing and to international exchange. As intellectuals who did not join the Communist Party, the Wus suffered under Mao's continuous revolution concept, which was aimed at curbing any revisionism. In the 1956 100 Flowers campaign, for instance, which invited public debate and then turned on those who participated in it, Qing's father was removed from his position at the university for the ideas that he put forth. A decade later came the Cultural Revolution from the mid-60s to the mid-70s, and that's when leaders, professors, diplomats were plucked from their jobs and sent out to work on farms. By this time, Wu Qing herself was a professor, and she had married a colleague, so they, like her parents, suffered intense public humiliation and then were sent to the countryside for manual labor. At the end of the Cultural Revolution, these are just a series of pictures of Wu Qing. At the end of the Cultural Revolution, Qing and her husband were able to return to their university jobs. And in 1984, she won an elected seat in the People's Congress of Haidian District. And that's really Beijing's intellectual hub. It's home to some 3 million people in more than a dozen universities. The next year, Wu Qing established the Women's Studies Forum. It was one of China's first non-government organizations. And then she began traveling widely to really promote gender awareness and women's empowerment in China. It was a life-changing year for her. She was appalled by what she saw of the plight of China's poor rural women. Women who contribute 65% of the country's labor and yet are illiterate and are often subject to arranged marriages, which Qing equated to enslavement. China has one of the highest suicide rates in the world. And in the rural suicides outnumber the urban suicides 3 to 1. And female suicides outnumber male suicides 3 to 1. It's particularly heavy in these rural areas. So Wu took action, and she established a training center where rural women and out-of-school rural girls learn livelihood skills and economic independence. And she's become a really strong advocate for women, not just in China, but women all around the world, in particular rural women. In 1987, she became the first non-party member put forward for the larger Beijing Municipal People's Congress. And she began studying the Chinese Constitution with a vengeance, going through it with a fine-tooth comb. And her conclusion was that the Constitution provided many more rights than most people realized. Moreover, she felt her interpretation was that there was an explicit mandate for congressional deputies like herself to supervise the work of the central government officials. And she decided that this was her task. And she began asserting herself, insisting that China's laws be honored and not be casually overwritten by authorities. She carries the Constitution with her everywhere. It's in her pocket. And she hands out copies to her constituents. And when they voice a complaint to her, she says, now you read the Constitution and you find out if it says something about that, and then you come back to me and we'll work that out together. And then she really took an unprecedented step, and that was to open her office every Tuesday for her constituents. What did you say they call her? The people's representative?
Yes.
Yes.
That's how people call it. If you read the Chinese, what do you say? Chinese, the book that she had, the book that she carries.
Yes, the Constitution.
Constitution. You would, if you read it, you will see, oh, that's the best. The thing is that yes, you put whatever there, but you don't do that. That's the problem in China. It's better than institution. I mean, it's better than the one here. But
Yeah, she says, yeah.
yes.
It's all there.
Freedom, speech, whatever. It's everything there.
Yeah.
But it's just not there yet.
So anyway, she meets with her constituents, and that's not what the other representatives do. So on Tuesdays, and she says, listening is fundamental to democracy. And then this is a quote from her: listen with 15 hearts, especially to those who have different views. Hearing her say this really gives me courage, especially as someone who writes on the edge of academia. I thought to myself, if the heart has a role in the gritty world of politics, surely there's room for it in scholarly pursuits. For me, all of my writing, be it history or biography or essay, is really a straight course from my heart to my head, to my notebook or my computer. Ching's fearless frankness at home and abroad gets her in trouble. After speaking at a conference in Norway a few years ago about the need to activate constitutionally provided rights in China, she wasn't allowed to leave China for 2 years. In the year 2000, her outspokenness cost her her university position. And in 2011, the Communist Party somehow managed to remove her name from election ballots. But she still remains true to her mission. She's working across many fronts to, in her words, change the system from one governed by rule of man to one governed by rule of law. In measure, she feels protected by by the stature of her parents, especially her mom, whose For Young Readers series continues to be read by millions of Chinese students in their formative years. But Wu says this: some people use their famous parents to make money. I use mine to stand for human rights in general and women's rights in particular. She serves on the board of several non-government organizations committed to the rights of women. Among those is the Women's World Summit Foundation, on whose board we serve together. And since 1991, that foundation has been building a global network for empowering women and advancing rights of women through various initiatives. And one of those initiatives is a prize for creativity in rural life, Every year, 10 to 15 women all around the world receive this award for their unique approaches to furthering the economic, social, and political positions of women. With almost no resources, and often with very little or no formal education, these women come up with ingenious solutions to shared problems that transform their lives and others. And every year, I have the privilege of editing their profiles for our newsletter and our website. And every year, without fail, I feel heartened by what I read. And now, as I wrap up, we really come full circle back to Maine and Wabanaki basket makers, because in 2003, Penobscot Teresa Secord, who's in the center there with the gold shawl around her, she's the founder and director of the Maine Indian Basket Makers Alliance. She was a recipient for the prize for creativity in rural life. I think it's important to mention that the Maine Indian Basket Makers Alliance that she helped to found, and that was prize-worthy, that really built on the shoulders of the Aroostook Micmac Basket Bank that Marlene was the director of in its first years. So this photo shows Teresa, and over to the right you see Wu Ching, who actually placed the shawl around her when she won. I should mention that the African-American woman, not immediately to the left of Wu Ching, but 2 people over, that's a woman named Betty McConey, who was another winner that year. She's from Zimbabwe, and she won for her work in championing the rights of girls through the Girl Child Network that she founded. Among the things that the network does, they stage these multi-village parades of women and girls carrying placards naming their rapists. It's just amazing. And Betty in 2009 was named one of those CNN heroes for her work protecting the powerless. As for Teresa, through the Maine Indian Basket Makers Alliance, with Richard, who's taking a picture, is part of that, as everybody in this front row. Through that work, Maine has grown from having 55 founding members of basket makers in this group to more than 200. The average age has dropped from 63 to 40, and the market value of the work has increased more than tenfold. MEBA is now recognized as one of the foremost Native arts and cultural organizations in the nation. It has an apprenticeship program and many other things. I look at Teresa, and I think of Sarah throwing her basket across the floor to prove that it wouldn't break, and none of her baskets ever did. And neither did these women who I've told you about tonight. Each of them, in their own distinct way, reached through the thickets of cultural separation, challenged the status quo, and fought for human dignity, revisiting their lives and fought for human dignity. And for me, as I was revisiting their lives in preparation for this lecture, it was just a humbling experience. And for me, it's been a vivid reminder of the specific ways each has informed my journey thus far. And it feels like a clarion call to carry forward in the years ahead the insights and the qualities of being that I found in them. So thank you for listening me out, and it's been wonderful to be here.
If people have questions for Betty, we can take questions. If you'd like to leave, feel free. Yeah.
Yes.
I need we're done.
Yeah.
Thank you, everyone, for coming. And we would like to present Buddy with a gift of our appreciation.
here. Oh, and has sage in it.
Haven't had to hear it.
I know. Thank you. Thank you all. I mean, I'm happy to answer any questions, but I know it's late. We could just mingle afterwards, those who want to stay, unless there's a specific group question. Okay, we're set. Yes.